There's a kind of silence that lives inside palaces. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest, the silence of things that cannot be said out loud, of secrets pressed behind gold-framed portraits and velvet curtains, of conversations that happen in hallways and stop the moment a door opens. Buckingham Palace has always been full of that silence. But in the winter of 2024, that silence cracked. And what came through it was something nobody on the outside had prepared themselves to hear. King Charles III was crying. Not in public, not in front of cameras, not the kind of careful, dignified moisture at the corner of the eye that royals are trained to allow themselves at funerals. This was something else. This was a man inside the walls of his own home, inside the life he had fought for decades to finally have, sitting with the weight of something he could not fix. The guards who served him, the staff who had known him for years, the advisors who had watched him grow from a boy into a king. They saw it, and what they saw shook them, because Charles was not crying about his health, though his health was its own quiet storm. He was crying about his family. To understand what was happening inside the palace in those months, you have to go back. Not years, decades. You have to go back to a young Charles, awkward and earnest, shaped by a mother who ruled a nation and a father who ruled through intimidation. You have to understand a man who spent the majority of his adult life waiting to be king, waiting to be taken seriously, waiting for the world to stop calling him the man who broke Diana's heart and start seeing who he actually was. That waiting did things to him, carved things into him, made him, in some ways, desperate for peace in his private life, even as his public life was a performance of control. When Camilla Parker Bowles finally became his wife in 2005, after everything, after Diana, after the affairs, after the public hatred, after the tabloid wars, Charles exhaled for the first time in what felt like his entire life. Camilla was not a fairy tale. She was better than that. She was real. She was warm. She made him laugh. She did not need him to be perfect. She just needed him to be there, and for a long time that was enough. But love, even genuine love, does not exist in isolation. It comes with people attached to it, and Camilla came with her family. The Parker Bowles family had always existed at the edge of royal life, close enough to feel the warmth, far enough to move freely. Camilla's children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez, were adults by the time their mother married the Prince of Wales. They had their own lives, their own careers, their own social circles. Tom, a food writer with a sharp wit and a sharper appetite for a good story, had always been a presence at the edges of royal events without ever being fully absorbed into the institution. Laura was quieter, more private, but no less connected. And then there were the wider tendrils, cousins-in-laws, associates, the loose network of people who orbited Camilla's world and, by extension, now orbited the crown. For years, the palace managed this. It was not always comfortable, but it was manageable. There were rules, spoken and unspoken, about how close Camilla's family could get to official royal business. There were lines drawn in rooms where lines are never written down. Everyone understood them, or so it seemed. What began to change, slowly, then all at once, was the behavior of certain members of that extended circle. Not Camilla herself, not her children directly, but people adjacent, people who carried the association like a key card, using it to open doors it was never meant to open. Business meetings arranged through quiet name drops. Social access granted because of who they were connected to rather than who they were. Invitations leveraged. Relationships monetized in ways that made the old guard inside the palace walls press their lips together and look at each other across long, polished tables. The royal guards, and here the term applies not just to the ceremonial figures at the gate, but to the inner circle of senior advisors and palace officials who have dedicated their professional lives to protecting the institution, began talking among themselves. Carefully, in the measured, precise language of people who understand that every word they say could be quoted back to them at the worst possible moment. Their concern was not personal. That is the first thing to understand. This was not about disliking Camilla. Many of them respected her enormously. She had, against all odds, navigated one of the most hostile public introductions in modern royal history, and come out the other side as queen consort with genuine dignity. She had softened Charles in ways that made him more human to the people he served. She had done, quietly and without fanfare, a great deal of good. But institutions are not protected by affection. They are protected by rules, and the rules were being bent. The conversations that reached Charles came to him the way difficult things always reach kings. Filtered, carefully worded, wrapped in enough diplomatic cushioning that the blow lands soft but still lands. His senior advisors did not walk into a room and say, "Your wife's family is becoming a problem." They are too sophisticated for that. What they did was present him, over a series of meetings, with a picture of incidents, a picture of patterns, a picture of what the press might make of certain things if certain things continued. Charles listened. He is by nature a listener. It is perhaps the quality that has made him both effective and wounded throughout his life. He takes things in. He processes. He carries. He does not discharge his feelings quickly or loudly. They accumulate inside him, quiet and dense like sediment at the bottom of still water. What he heard in those meetings was that the people closest to him, professionally and institutionally, were urging the palace to create distance. Not from Camilla, from the wider network around her. A formal, quiet restructuring of access. A tightening of what the family connection could and could not provide in terms of proximity to the crown. It was, in the language of palaces, a reasonable request. In the language of a husband, it was something else entirely. Charles had given up a great deal for the life he now lived. He had watched his son Harry walk away from the institution in a blaze of interviews and accusations that still burned when he thought about them. He had watched his relationship with William become something formal and careful in ways it had not always been. He had fought cancer with the stoic quiet of a man who has learned that showing fear is a luxury he cannot afford. And through all of it, Camilla had been the constant, the warm, steady, unmoving thing at the center of his private life. To hear that the institution he had devoted his entire existence to was now asking him to draw a line between that woman's family and the palace, to hear that even this, even the last safe corner of his life, could not remain untouched, that is what broke him. Not anger, not outrage, something quieter and more devastating. He sat alone in one of the smaller rooms of Sandringham, in the late afternoon light of a November that had come in cold and gray, and he wept. The kind of weeping that has no audience and no performance in it. The kind that comes when a person finally understands that there is no version of their life that gets to be easy, that something will always have to be sacrificed, that the crown does not stop asking, even when it has already taken everything it can reasonably take. The staff who saw him in those hours said nothing publicly. They never do, but they remembered. Outside, the world continued in its ordinary noise, headlines and gossip and the endless churn of opinion. Nobody outside the palace walls knew what was happening inside them. Nobody knew that a king was sitting in a cold room in November, crying not from weakness, but from the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent his whole life trying to hold everything together and is only now, at the age of 75, beginning to understand that some things cannot be held. The question was not whether the palace would act. The question was what Charles would do when they did. Because a king who weeps in private is still a king in public. And the men and women who had urged this action knew, even as they presented their careful picture of patterns and incidents, that they were not just asking for a policy change. They were asking Charles to choose. And in the history of this family, in the long, painful, sometimes brutal history of what the crown has required of the people who wear it, that kind of choice has never been made without cost. It has never been made without someone, somewhere, walking away changed, diminished, carrying something they will never fully put down. Charles had already made so many of those choices. He would have to make one more. The palace went quiet again. The guards returned to their posts. The advisors filed out of rooms and back to their offices. The machinery of the institution continued its slow, powerful turning. And somewhere inside it, a man sat with his hands in his lap and tried to figure out how to love his wife and serve his country and keep his family intact all at the same time. He had never managed to do all three at once. He was not sure he could start now. There's a particular kind of loyalty that exists inside royal households. It is not the loyalty of friendship, though it can look like that from the outside. It is older than friendship. It is the loyalty of people who have built their entire professional identities around an institution, who have given their best years to protecting something larger than themselves, who have watched monarchs come and go and learned over decades of service that their job is not to love the people they serve, but to protect the thing those people represent. The men and women who run the inner workings of the British monarchy understand something that most people outside those walls never will. The crown is not a person. The crown is an idea. And ideas require maintenance in ways that persons sometimes cannot afford to provide. This distinction matters enormously when you try to understand what happened in the months after Charles's private collapse in that Sandringham room. Because the advisors who had brought their concerns to the king did not stop working. They continued methodically and without sentimentality to build their case. They documented. They traced connections. They mapped the ways in which the social and financial activities of people adjacent to the Queen Consort's family had begun to press against the invisible walls that separate private royal life from public royal responsibility. The specific incidents, by themselves, might have seemed small to an outside observer. A business arrangement here, a social event leveraged there, a name dropped in a room where names of that weight are supposed to remain at the door. None of it was in isolation catastrophic. But institutions are not undone by catastrophes. Catastrophes are manageable. Institutions are undone by accumulation, by the slow, steady erosion of the lines that give them their shape. The advisors understood this. They had seen it before in other forms with other families. They knew what the first chapter of an unraveling looked like. And they were not prepared to let it reach the second chapter. Their recommendation, when it finally came in formal terms, was not a purge. It was not a dramatic severing. It was something more surgical and, in some ways, more brutal for being so clinical. They proposed a formal restructuring of access protocols, a set of defined boundaries around what the Parker Bowles family connection could provide in terms of proximity to official palace business, royal events, and the broader network of relationships that cluster around the crown. In plain language, Camilla's wider family circle was to be quietly, firmly, and permanently moved further from the center. The recommendation landed on Charles's desk in the careful language of institutional governance. He read it the way he reads everything, thoroughly, slowly, with the full weight of his attention. The people around him watched his face for a reaction and found nothing readable there. Charles has had 75 years of practice at keeping his face neutral when his heart is doing something else entirely. But Camilla knew. She always knows. That is, in fact, one of the things Charles has always loved about her. She does not need him to explain himself. She reads the atmosphere of a room the way a sailor reads the sky. She had felt the shift in the palace even before the formal recommendation existed on paper. She had noticed things, small things, the kind that only register if you're paying a particular kind of attention. The way certain meetings were scheduled, and she was not told. The way certain advisors greeted her with warmth but did not meet her eyes. The way her husband came to bed some nights carrying a heaviness that was different from the heaviness of cancer treatments and public duties. She did not confront him immediately. That is not how she operates. Camilla is not a confronter. She is a waiter. She lets things come to her rather than chasing them. And she has learned, over a lifetime of complicated relationships and complicated circumstances, that the things worth knowing always find their way to the surface eventually. When Charles finally told her, not about the tears, not about the Sandringham afternoon, but about the recommendation, about what the palace was proposing, she was quiet for a long time. Then, she said something that Charles would think about for weeks afterward. She said, "I knew this was coming. I always knew something like this was coming." There was no bitterness in her voice, according to the people close enough to the couple to hear these things secondhand. There was something more complicated than bitterness. There was the resignation of a woman who has spent her entire adult life understanding, on some cellular level, that her place in the life of this man would never be entirely simple. That every space she occupied would require negotiation. That even now, even as queen, even after everything, she would still be asked to give things up. Her own complicated feelings about her family's behavior, whether she knew more than she let on, whether she had tried to manage things from the inside before they reached the palace formally, whether she was surprised or only pretending not to be surprised, none of that was ever made entirely public. These are the rooms inside rooms that exist in every royal household. The spaces where a person gets to be simply human without having to account for it to an institution or a press or a watching world. What is known is what happened next. The palace began implementing the changes quietly. Access was restructured. Protocols were tightened. The social architecture that had allowed certain people to move in certain circles because of who they were connected to was gently, firmly redrawn. It was done in the way that palace business is always done at its most serious, without announcement, without press release, without any official acknowledgement that it was happening at all. The silence around it was almost louder than a statement would have been. In the broader world, pieces of this began to leak. Not in any organized way, not from a single source, but in the way that palace secrets always eventually leak, in fragments through the cracks between people, in the gap between what someone knows and what they can resist mentioning. Journalists who cover the royal family began picking up signals. The kind of signals that are not stories yet, but are becoming stories, a change in seating arrangements here, an absence at an event there, a source who says something carefully unprovable but directionally clear. By early 2025, the outline of what was happening had begun to appear in the press, assembled from those fragments into something approximating the truth, though always with the gaps that come from covering a world that guards its own information as a survival instinct. The reaction among the British public was complicated, as reactions to things involving Charles and Camilla have always been complicated. There is still, even now, a segment of the public for whom Camilla will never be fully forgiven, for whom she is permanently the woman who came between Charles and Diana, regardless of what the historical record actually shows about the complexity of that marriage. These people receive the news of palace tension with a kind of grim satisfaction, a confirmation of their suspicions, a sign that even now she could not keep her house in order. But there was another reaction, quieter and perhaps more significant, among people who had watched Charles's transformation over the past decade, who had seen him grow into his role as king with a kind of late-life earnestness that was hard not to find moving. There was something closer to sympathy, a recognition that here was a man who had already sacrificed enormous amounts of his private life on the altar of public duty, and who was being asked to sacrifice more. Nobody outside the palace knew about the crying. Nobody knew about Sandringham in November. Nobody knew that a man had sat in a cold room and wept because even this, even the last warm thing, was being reshaped by the demands of an institution that does not stop requiring. The guards outside the palace gates stood at their posts in their ceremonial uniforms, motionless and unreadable, as they always do. Inside, the machinery continued turning. Advisors met and drafted and revised. Charles continued his public schedule, the engagements, the speeches, the careful management of a king dealing with his own illness while running a monarchy. He showed up. He always shows up. That is perhaps the most consistent thing about him. But people who knew him well, who had worked with him for years and could read the things his face refused to show, noticed something different in those months. A quality of tiredness that was not physical, a weight that sat differently than the weight of illness. The weight of a man who has realized that love, even real love, even the love that finally came right after everything went wrong, is not a refuge from the world. It is just another thing the world can reach into. His relationship with Camilla did not break. That much is clear. Whatever happened in those conversations, whatever private negotiations took place in the rooms that history will not fully record, they remained. They held. Charles was not going to lose Camilla. He was not going to be asked to lose Camilla. But something shifted in the geometry of their life together. Something was reconfigured. Something that had been close was moved to a greater distance. And the moving of it cost something that cannot be quantified in the language of policy documents or palace protocols. It cost in the currency of private life. And private life, for people who live mostly in public, is the only currency that actually matters. The recommendation was implemented. The restructuring was complete. The palace moved on, as it always does, to the next thing requiring management. Charles moved on too, or appeared to. But those who had been in the room, who had seen the carefully worded documents, who had watched his face as he absorbed them, who had been close enough in those winter months to understand what was really happening beneath the formal language of institutional governance, those people knew something that the headlines would never quite capture. The king had not just lost something administrative. He had lost another piece of the belief that there existed, somewhere, a version of his life that would eventually stop asking him to pay. That belief had been dwindling for decades. In those months, it came very close to running out entirely. What happened after, how Charles carried this forward, how Camilla responded, how the family rebuilt itself around the new shape of things, how the palace managed what came next, is where the story becomes not just about a king and his court, but about something more fundamental, about what it costs to hold an institution together when the institution keeps demanding to be held by someone who is also, underneath everything, just a person. That accounting was still coming. The palace was quiet. The guards were at their posts. And somewhere inside, a man was getting ready for what came next. He had always been good at getting ready. What he had never learned to do was stop paying the price for it. Kingdoms do not fall in a single moment. They shift. They lean. They develop cracks so fine that you cannot see them until the light hits a certain angle, and then you wonder how you ever missed them. The British monarchy has survived world wars and abdications and public hatred and the kind of grief that plays out on a global television screen. It has outlasted predictions of its collapse more times than anyone can count. It endures not because it is invincible, but because it is adaptive, because the people at its center have always been willing, when the pressure reached a certain point, to bend rather than break. Charles had always bent. His entire life was a study in bending. Bending to duty when he wanted privacy. Bending to expectation when he wanted authenticity. Bending to the institution when he wanted desperately and unsuccessfully for most of his adult life to simply be a man rather than a symbol. He had bent so many times, in so many directions, that sometimes he wondered whether there was still a shape underneath all the bending. Whether if you stripped away the crown and the protocol and the carefully maintained public face, there was a Charles left, or just the impression of one. The months that followed the restructuring were, in many ways, the quietest and the hardest. Quiet because the palace had closed around the matter with the practiced efficiency of an institution that has been managing sensitive information for centuries. There were no public statements. There were no dramatic departures. There was no visible severance that would allow the press to write a definitive story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The changes happened in the background, in the adjustment of guest lists and access points, and the invisible social architecture that governs who gets to stand where in the world of the crown. Hard because the quiet did not mean the matter was resolved. It meant it was contained. Camilla, to her enduring credit, handled what was happening with a composure that impressed even the people who had been most concerned about the situation. She understood, better perhaps than Charles himself, that this was not about her. It was not a judgment of her character or her marriage or the legitimacy of her place beside the king. It was about the institution and the institution's needs and the fact that the institution had been protecting itself for 1,000 years before either of them was born and would continue protecting itself long after they were gone. She had always understood that her relationship with Charles existed inside a larger structure. She had made her peace with that understanding a long time ago. It is, in fact, what made her the right person for this role. Not her breeding or her charm or her ability to handle a crowd, though she is all of those things. What made her right was that she never confused the crown with Charles. She loved one. She respected the other. She knew the difference. Her children, Tom and Laura, processed what was happening with varying degrees of visibility. Tom, who has always had a public presence through his work and his writing, said nothing publicly. Laura, who has always preferred the margins, disappeared further into them. The extended family members most directly affected by the new access protocols did what people in their position almost always do. They absorbed the message, recalibrated their expectations, and continued their lives. There were no dramatic public confrontations. There was no one standing at the palace gates demanding an explanation. The British aristocracy has always been very good at managing its humiliations in private. But the effect on Charles was something that unfolded over weeks and months in ways that were not dramatic enough to make headlines, but were visible to anyone paying close enough attention. He seemed, in those months, to be carrying something. Not the illness, that was its own visible weight, present in the occasional public frailty, in the careful management of his schedule, in the moments when you could see, even through the controlled surface of a public appearance, that his body was fighting battles he did not get to choose. This was different. This was internal. The weight of a man who has arrived at a late life reckoning with the terms of his existence, and found those terms no more generous than they have always been. He threw himself into his work with a focus that struck some of his staff as almost compulsive. The environmental causes he has championed for 5 decades. The Commonwealth engagements. The charitable foundations that have been the scaffolding of his public purpose since long before he was king. He showed up for all of it with the same diligent, slightly formal earnestness that has always characterized him. The Charles who genuinely wants to make things better, who has ideas and energy and a conviction that institutions can be reformed from within if you are patient enough and persistent enough and willing to take the long view. He is, at his core, a man who believes in the long view. It is both his greatest strength and the thing that has cost him the most. Because the long view requires accepting things in the present tense that are painful. It requires holding losses quietly and continuing to function. It requires a kind of emotional deferral, a belief that the accounting will come later, that meaning will eventually be made of what hurts now. Charles has deferred a very great deal across his 7 decades. His capacity for deferral is, by any measure, extraordinary. But even extraordinary capacity has limits. And in those months, people who knew him well began to see, in the unguarded moments, that he was approaching one. The relationship between Charles and William during this period became a subject of quiet speculation among those closest to both men. William, who has always had a complex relationship with the Camilla question, who carried for years the particular pain of a child who felt his mother's place was being taken. William had made his own separate peace with the reality of his father's marriage over time. He respected Camilla. He had come to appreciate what she brought to his father's life. But he had also always been protective of the monarchy in a way that sometimes put him in alignment with the institutional voices rather than the personal ones. Whether William was among those who had quietly supported the recommendations, whether he had been consulted, whether his view had been factored into the palace's decision, is not something that has ever been confirmed publicly. But the question hovered in the background of the family's dynamics like an unasked thing, present in the way certain conversations did not happen, in the way certain rooms were entered differently than they used to be. Charles and William have always loved each other with the particular difficulty of fathers and sons who are also colleagues in the most high-stakes professional environment imaginable. Their relationship is not simple. It was never simple, but it had in recent years found a kind of working stability, a mutual recognition that they needed each other, that the project of the monarchy required both of them to function, that whatever private wounds existed between them were less important than the shared responsibility they carried. In those months, the stability held, but it held the way things hold when there is quiet pressure on all sides, carefully, with attention, without anyone making sudden movements. Underneath all of this, underneath the institutional management and the family dynamics and the public appearances and the illness and the restructuring and the loss, There was the thing that nobody talked about directly, but that everyone who knew Charles understood was at the center of everything. He was tired. Not the tiredness of a man who needs sleep. The tiredness of a man who has been paying costs his entire life and has begun to wonder, in the honest hours before dawn when there is no one to perform for, whether the balance sheet will ever come out even. Whether all of this giving, of privacy, of selfhood, of the ordinary human right to have a personal life that the institution does not reach into, will eventually amount to something that was worth it. He has devoted himself to an idea of service that is, in some ways, the most demanding idea a person can commit to. Service to something larger than yourself. Service that does not end when you are tired, that does not pause when you are sick, that does not relent when it has already taken everything you thought you had to give. There are days when that idea sustains him. Days when he stands in front of a crowd or plants a tree or reads a briefing about something his foundation has managed to change, and he feels the truth of what he chose. Days when the long view makes sense, when the deferral feels justified, when the cost feels like investment rather than loss. And there are the other days, the Sandringham afternoons, the cold rooms, the wait that has no official name. By the spring of 2025, something had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way the press was able to capture cleanly, but in a way that real shifts in real people always happen. Quietly, gradually, in the accumulation of small adjustments that eventually add up to something new. Charles had arrived, it seemed, at a different kind of acceptance. Not the resignation of a man who has given up. Something more complicated and more hard-won than resignation. The acceptance of a man who has finally, after decades of hoping otherwise, genuinely understood that there is no version of his life that will not require this. That the crown will always be reaching into the private rooms. That the institution will always be protecting itself, even when the protecting hurts him. That he cannot change the nature of the thing he has given his life to, and that fighting that nature is a different kind of loss than accepting it. He accepted it. He continued. Camilla stood beside him, not unchanged. No one who has been through something like that comes through unchanged, but present. Still the warm, steady, real thing she has always been in his life. Still making him laugh, which is, by all accounts, no small thing. Still being the person who knows the difference between Charles and the crown and loves the former without pretending the latter does not exist. The guards at the palace gates continued their rotations. The advisors continued their meetings. The press continued assembling its fragments into stories that were always incomplete. And the king continued his work. Showed up. Paid what was asked of him. Carried what cannot be put down. He is, at 75, exactly the man he was shaped to be by a difficult childhood and a complicated youth and a middle age defined by public failure and private resilience and a love story that the world refused to accept until it had no choice. He is a man who has learned over and over that duty and desire are not the same thing, and that the gap between them is where most of his actual life has been lived. He is a man who cried in a cold room in November and then got up the next morning and did his job. That is perhaps the truest thing about him. Not the crown, not the scandal, not the decades of waiting, not the love story that divided a nation. The truest thing about Charles is that he keeps getting up. It is not glamorous. It is not the stuff of fairy tales, but it is real. And in a life that has required him to perform so much for so long, real is perhaps the rarest and most precious thing he has managed to hold on to. The palace is quiet again. It is always quiet again. That is the thing about palaces and institutions and the people who give their lives to them. The silence returns. The work continues. And the man inside it carries what he carries, the way he has always carried it. Without audience, without resolution, without the relief of a clean ending. Just forward. Always forward. That has always been enough. It has to be.